Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of GameCamp webinars. Today we'll have the session focus on growing revenue with ad monetization. I think very interesting topic. We see a lot of growth in this area, so I'm sure you will have a lot of new insights, a lot of knowledge around the topic. And together with us, we have a few amazing speakers. So let's invite to the stage Michal Hablovic, who is ad monetization manager at Pixel Federation.
Hey guys.
And then Boże Jankowicz, who is business development manager at GameCamp Consulting.
Hello everyone, thank you for joining.
Hello. And then Vlad Minten, who is apps and gaming strategic partner manager at Google.
Hello, everyone. Looking forward to this conversation.
Hello. Thank you guys for joining and sharing the knowledge with the audience. So, of course, as always, we're inviting everyone to add the questions at Slido. Please just go to the Slido website and then just write GameCamp as the name of the event, and then you are able to ask the questions. And what's more, you will be able to vote for the questions added by other people, and we can use it during the session and at the end of the sessions when we have Q&A discussion. And not waiting more time, if we go to another slide, let's actually start with the first presentation from Michal Hablovic, who will be sharing the most important aspects of starting Waterfalls in ad monetization. Michal, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Mariusz. Sorry, just the trolley goes over. So I'm Michal from Pixel Federation, and first of all, I really want to thank Mariusz for this opportunity and for him to build and maintain the great community around GameCamp. So first things first, a few words about my company and myself. So Pixel Federation is around for 13 years. We are based in Bratislava, Slovakia, and we are the biggest free-to-play studio in the region. I joined Pixel Federation 7 years ago as a producer, and I somehow pushed and taking care of ad monetization in our company from the early beginning. Because the revenue stream from ads growth over time, I switched to ad monetization role a year ago, and right now the Pixel is doing somewhere around 30% of its revenue from ads. Basically, when Mariusz approached me about this presentation, I was thinking about what could be beneficial for you guys, and what I want to somehow cover and give you is something that I was missing when I started back a few years ago. Some type of blueprint for starting with mediation and manual waterfall setups, because when you are kind of a new in the game and you are only one taking care of this topic in your company, it can be intimidating to change something and to do something, because at the end it's about the money and you don't want to mess up a big time. So I want to provide you with some type of tips and walk you through the initial setup. I don't want to cover some kind of really specific topics. Just after this session, you should be able to create and run your first waterfall and know what you are doing and see the initial results and taking it from there. So let's jump into it. So how we got here, the kind of evolution of ad serving. So probably everybody will start with one ad network, so it's easiest to set up, and you will have only one partner to deal with. Then there is the mediation in auto-optimized mode, meaning that you will add more ad networks into your stack, meaning more partners to work with. But in terms of revenue, it's definitely a step up. Then there is this manual waterfall setup. I'm seeing it as a kind of a upgrade of the auto-optimized mode. And then there is a bidding, a real-time bidding. It's I really hope that this is I think that this is the future for the industry, but we are somewhere here stuck in the middle of those two. So maybe you can run your kind of a stack full-time bidding, but I don't think that it's the best way to go right now. As everything has this pros and cons, I approach this so you will know that pros and cons for every single one of them. For one ad network, it's really easy to set up. So you just need to contact your provider and set it up. It's fewer SDKs and adapters means happy programmers. They will love you for less SDKs. If you will bring more ad networks and more stuff and more adapters and more SDKs, he will know the struggle, because the programmers basically hate it because you need to update the SDKs in some reasonable time. It's really easy to troubleshoot when you have only one ad network to deal with. When something went wrong, when there is like some kind of broken ad being shown to users, you just know who to contact. So it's really easy to troubleshoot, and this is something that I'm really missing from back in the days. The negative part of it, it's limited demand. So basically, if you are handling only you're working with only one ad network, you're limited for theirs inventory only. So it's not that impressive. So basically, no competition means lower eCPM, and lower eCPM means less revenue for you at the end. Auto-optimized mediation. So we will add more ad networks to your stack and leave it for mediator to decide who will win the auction, and not the auction, sorry, but who will get the first impression. So it's also easy to set up and maintain, because you don't need to create those instances overall. You don't have to fill anything. You just create maybe 1, maybe 3 instances per network, and you are fine to go, and let all the kind of managing to the mediation itself. So basically, don't need to tweak it so often. So you just let it go, leave it alone. Higher demand coming from the more ad networks involved means higher impressions, more impressions, and more higher eCPMs. That at the end means that you will be earning more. On the other hand, working the mediation itself, when they deciding who will serve the first impression or who will serve the ad, is working with delayed data. So they are working with data with yesterday's performance. So basically, this is something that's definitely not good. And mediator will decide who served the ad. I'm kind of enjoying the hands-on approach of manual waterfalls, and it's really pain in the ass, at least to troubleshoot multiple ad networks. Sometimes it's really hard to find out who is responsible for the broken ad you are showing to your payers even, or who is why your app is crashing, but you know that it's coming from the ads, but you don't have a clue from which network. So sometimes it's really hard to find out who is responsible for it. So this is something that I think there is a really space to kind of fill in and to industry to grow into. Well, this is something that I want to share, because we went through a whole journey from one ad network to real-time bidding. So, and you can probably guess where we tried and where we step up and add another networks. So yeah, you can probably guess it was here. So from here, when we add more ad networks to our stack, we triple tripled our ad revenue and quadrupled our average revenue per daily active users by more impressions being served. This of course, it really depends on the ad networks you are working with currently and the ad networks you will be implementing. In this case, we started with Iron Source, and we add AdMob and later then Facebook. So I think that this spikes only was by adding the AdMob to the stack. So it was pretty impressive. Manual waterfall. I really like waterfalls. I like to digging into them. So the pros are definitely it's really good performance in terms of ad revenue and ARPDAU. You can squeeze a lot of money from it by switching from automated, but it's really time consuming, and you need to kind of tweak it on a daily basis and to operate effectively. So it's not something that you can do it by your own, but it will consume some portion of your time, definitely. And ad latency, speaking of ad waterfalls, if you will be building some kind of a huge waterfalls with 40, 30 plus instances, the ad latency is something that you should be thinking of and look into. Basically, if it's working in order selected by you, it's still not 100 effective. So this is something that it still has some flaw, but it's better than automediated setup. So this is something that needs to be covered. And as I said, we went through whole journey, and by switching the TraceStation 2 and Seaport from auto setup to manual waterfall setup, we saw growth in average revenue per daily active users in between 4 to 48 and 18 to 77% on Seaport. Basically, why we didn't do proper A/B test there was that I was quite sure about the result, and I wasn't patient enough to wait another 2 weeks just to confirm that this was the good step. So we decided to take the countries without waterfall as a kind of a baseline. So I'm pretty confident it's not 100% accurate, but it's good enough for me to be sure that manual waterfalls make sense to switch to. And then there is a bidding. So basically, highest bid for every single impression. So if it's real time, you should be able to have the most value for that impression. So by itself, it's working with real-time data. So this is something that is really great. It's super easy to set up and operate. This is something that I think it's really great. You can earn a lot of time and do what you really want to do. And it has better performance. On the other side, it's a quite divided market still. So there is like many ad networks that has their own bidding platform, and we are still not in the phase that you can like have all networks you will live to in the one mediation platform. So this is something that it's still not happening, and there are still many networks without bidding option. I think that this is something that it's changing. It's still changing, but yeah, we are getting there. And speaking of switching to bidding, we did a proper A/B test this time because we decided to go and agreed on case study with Facebook and Iron Source. So we ran a proper A/B test for 3 weeks on TraceStation 2, and the results were that we gained like 10 to 12% in ad revenue and average revenue per daily active user as well. So this was really good. So that was the kind of a first time, and we can probably jump into the second part of it. So I think that this will be like the interesting part. So creating your first waterfalls is something that you definitely want to heard about. So you need to kind of follow a few really simple steps. You need to find your baseline. You need to select countries you want to run in manual waterfall setup, and then create instances and build manual waterfall, and then optimize. And the optimize phase will be like repeating itself. So finding your baseline. So I suggest you that you run mediation in auto-optimize mode for a few weeks. So you will be able to find your baselines in terms of average eCPM you are seeing for every single country you are serving your game in, and by building I suggest you to have at least 3 instances per network for the beginning in auto-optimize mode, and by that you will find those numbers you will be looking for. Then you want to select your countries you want to run your waterfall in. Basically, you want to manage countries that bringing you significant portion of revenue or significant portion of impressions. By that I mean that because if there is like some small country, if you will be handling it by waterfall, it's maybe it's not worth the effort, because if the waterfall setup will bring you an additional, I don't know, 20% uplift of the revenue, the effort on I don't know, some country which is bringing you maybe 500 a month is not worth it. So this is why you should look on the revenue and impressions. If you don't have that much impressions in that specific country, but you want to be able to somehow manage it by the waterfall, you will be looking for other countries with similar eCPMs with some reasonable impressions, and then you can somehow put them in one basket.
Michal?
Sure.
Yes. Can I ask a question?
Sure, of course.
Yeah, so it's like if you are like how closely do you work with the product teams in terms of like working on ad monetization? Because I understand, like, you know, in growing the game, often there is like, especially on that game that is like coming out of purchases coming from users who are just paying for some specific items in the game.
Mm-hmm.
Some challenge of potential cannibalization. There is like discussion how to actually either to adjust the game for like bigger purchases, or maybe how to actually adjust the game to broader the number of users who are monetizing in a way. How closely do you work with them actually?
Yeah, basically as close as possible, but I'm dealing with this ad monetization in our company by myself, so it's really time consuming, so I'm doing my best. And but yeah, I do have like scheduled calls with every single team, and we are discussing these topics on a regular basis. Basically, I try to bring the new formats on the table, and discuss the kind of opportunities we can have, and maybe even placement and stuff like that. And we somehow coordinate the some kind of feature being developed that has the ad monetization aspect within it.
So you mean that like more and more often you are like developing specific features, having in mind like monetization as well, correct?
Absolutely, because there is like the portion of the revenue is quite impressive, and it's still growing. So the ads themselves somehow proved viability. So I think that it's definitely something that game developers and even producers, they at the end they listen to the kind of a sound of the money. So if the feature can bring the money, if the ad monetization can bring the money to the table, it's something that they will be listening to.
Thank you very much.
So so after you selected your countries, you will be sorry. So we just create the tiers for the countries you want to kind of work with in combined mode. So after that, I just lost my notes. Sorry. So I'm back. Okay. Sorry, I just lost my tab with the presentation. So let's create the instances. So I'm starting with 3+1 ad networks. So my personal go-to ad networks will be like AdMob because of the highest eCPM we are seeing in our titles. Facebook Audience Network because of their huge demand, and the Unity because they have solid demand and decent eCPMs. And then it's ironSource, Wangle, Uplavin, whatever you choose. And maybe if you decided to go with mediator from different ad network, you will probably have to have them as well. So this is something that you will want to create. After that, naming, it's really good to have some and stick to some kind of convention in terms of naming your instances, so you will know what you are looking at when you are checking the waterfall. There is this kind of a simple approach that you can see around a lot. It's just the application name or abbreviation platform, and then it's high, mid, low for waterfall floors. So you will be the high instance will be having the highest eCPM floor. This is somehow how we can approach it on our titles. This is TraceStation 2 Google Play high and TraceStation 2 low. Yeah, I forgot to add the Google Play on iOS platform. So basically, and then there is this kind of a complex approach that I'm doing currently. I'm adding the value of the floor itself right into the name. So after I'm able to kind of spot the difference between floor I set and the performance of the instance. So it's more easy for me to kind of see the difference and operate this way, but it's definitely more time consuming because you need to rename the instance every single time you will make the change, and you will make the change a lot. So then you need to build your waterfall, the structure. So by checking your average eCPM per network for that specific country you want to build your waterfall, you take it and at least double it. So don't stay humble. You need to at least double it, because you will be really surprised how high those eCPM can grow when you will like put in the effort. And then you will basically altering the ad networks based on their performance in auto mode. And after that, I suggest you should be running it for at least a week or two, and then see the results. So this was kind of for example, as we saw, there was the US in the previous slides. There was this average eCPM for US for $36. I will go for 80 without a blink. So I think that this is the way to go. And really, when I started, I was really trying to be low profile. I just grow the eCPM floors over time, and we started at, I don't know, maybe 45. Back then I couldn't imagine that it will be more than 70, and yeah, we did have the floors on Diggy's Adventure somewhere around 108 and maybe 200. So it will grow. So I can say that. So, and after that, you will end up with something like this. So we are using ironSource Mediation as our partner. So this is screenshot from that. And as you can see, there is like many instances. You will only have like 12. But so when you want to optimize the waterfalls, you want to check the kind of anomalies. So we will be looking for something that is not like in the same order as something else. So what I'm looking for is chunks of impressions. when you can see something like that, you will want to increase the floor or add another floor or add another ad networks. As you can see here on AdMob on the first call, and then there is like AdMob on the 16th. That's because I currently switched this position to auto optimized, and it's working pretty well, but it's not like the kind of a really manual waterfall this time. After that, if you can see if some instance will have only like small portion of impressions, you want to lower the level or get rid of it. So you want to check the fill rates mainly for the top, for these high instances, for the first floors, and it's fill rate or match rate on AdMob. And if you will have for those top instances fill rate higher than 6%, you should increase the floor, and if it's lower than 3, then you could lower the floor. But this is not again, this is not something that's set in stone. You will need to like find your own numbers, which makes sense. But this is something that how I operate. And then be brave, because you need to A/B test if it's possible. But sometimes it's just not worth the effort, as I think. So I need that you need absolutely check your data and progress. Let me check that. Sorry, I lost this button again. Okay, so I don't look only on eCPM because eCPM is it's a good indicator. So you should check the eCPM as well. But it's a good indicator of if your kind of changes are doing the way you predict it would. But at the end, you should be looking for on the overall money, on average revenue per daily active user, because this is what you want to grow. And speak to your ad network account managers, because those are guys who can help a lot, and they help us a lot. And basically you want to repeat these steps until your first million, which is something that we probably all of us aiming for. But I have one more thing for you, and that's the kind of all country setup bonus. This is something that Božo brings in when we spoke like few months ago, and I was thinking about the setting the waterfall for the all countries group, because when you deciding those countries you want to specifically spend your time on, and you are building waterfalls for, there will be like all the other countries that you didn't decided to go for. And I suggest that you should kind of create some small waterfall for that group. And I was thinking about it, but Božo bring that up, that we should definitely try it, because it should be worth it, and it was worth it a lot, because we nearly doubled the revenue from those countries, and it wasn't like it was really well spent, I don't know, maybe hour or so. So that's it. So basically, I really hope that you find it useful. And if you have another question, you have Slido, or ping me on LinkedIn or whatever.
Thank you, Michal, for great presentation. Really appreciate it. Maybe one question before we go to another another session. Sorry, there is a question: how often do you adjust the floor price?
Basically, it really depends. I will check the performance, and if there will be like some spike, or some impressions will getting dense on some level, I will do the change. But I try to not do it more often than like bi-weekly or maybe weekly. It don't make sense to do it like on the daily basis, because I assume that ad networks algorithms need to somehow find out that there is this floor and like do the background math, and I always let for a few days, at least week, for this change to set up.
Thanks, Michal. I also have a question if we still have a little bit of time and like wiggle room. As you can imagine, like in this webinar, there should be like a lot of different companies that are, some are just starting off with as monetization, some are more experienced. If you were to sort of advise, like give it advice to like one of the companies that are just kicking off with as monetization, what approach would you actually recommend them to go with? Like, should they invest some like full-time employee to sit and like set up all the manual waterfalls and like go with the granular approach, or maybe it's worth for them to start considering something more automated from the beginning and then potentially with time go into this?
Yeah. As you can see that we somehow proved that real-time bidding is the kind of bringing the most value this time, at least for us. But I think that it's really important for company to be sure that what they are getting is the best. So I will suggest that if you are some small scale company, jump right into bidding, but later on try manual waterfalls and do the proper A/B test. So, but yeah, from the beginning, if you have no manpower at all, or you will have definitely many tasks on the table you need to kind of do before I will jump right to the bidding. But after that, I will try to kind of prove that the bidding is the right for me.
Sweet, thank you.
Thank you, Michal, for the great presentation. And then let's invite and of course stay with us for the last part that will be like discussion and Q&A. But now let's invite our second speaker, Boże Jankowicz, who will be like continuing the topic of waterfall and how to even get more out of it, especially how to maximize the ARPDAU through even effective waterfall and bidding management.
Thank you, Mariusz. Thank you for the invitation. Always pleasure to be working with you. Hello, everyone. As Mariusz said, my name is Boże Jankowicz, and I'm a business development manager at GameBiz Consulting. Just a few words about ourselves. So GameBiz is a consultancy firm for the video games industry. We basically help video game developers with all sorts of different business matters. On one hand, we're helping game developers monetize their games through ads, and this is something that I mostly deal with. And beyond that, we're also helping developers finding a publisher or funding for their projects, if that's something that they're in need of, or for some companies, they really need some strategic guidance in how to develop their studios and bring them to the next level. This is also something that we do. I've been with GameBiz for over a year now, and previously I worked at Norius, a game developer from Serbia and one of the biggest developers in this region. So yeah, I'll probably just continue where Michal stopped and kind of try to build on that. So I'll just briefly give you an overview of the hybrid mediation model and which stage we are at right now. Then I'll explain of which metrics we should focus on and beyond just eCPM. The biggest chunk of the presentation will actually be some of the best practices for mediation management. And at the end, I'll share examples of many of my clients and basically some of the tips I'll be sharing before this section. I'll give you a lot of examples and basically case studies on how those tips worked out for us. Of course, at the end, we'll have time for the questions. Okay, let's just start. So as Michal mentioned, probably where most of the industry was, let's say, a year ago, and where a big part of the industry is right now, is waterfall-based mediation with multiple instances. This means that we are that in our mediation we are calling each of the buyers, each of the networks, several times with different price points, and this solution requires a lot of time and manual work. On the other hand, where the industry is going is bidding-based solution, in which we will have each buyer, each mediated network called only once, but they will be able to, but we are basically choosing the winner of this auction based on the highest price. And so there's no manual work involved in this approach. However, the industry has still not reached this point. And so while we are in between these setups, in a kind of a limbo, what is something that many developers are basically adopting right now, or have already transitioned into this setup, is hybrid mediation model. So this is something that takes advantages of one model, but also some of the advantages of the other. So basically, in this approach, we will still have some buyers which are called multiple times. In this particular example, we see buyer 3 called 2 times, as well as buyer 4 and buyer 5. And we manually set the prices for these buyers. However, there are also, on top of this, there are a few bidders who are bidding for every single impression, and where we do not have to deal with multiple instances or setting up different prices, but we're actually let them run on their own, believing that they will maximize our revenue in combination with a manual waterfall setup. So this is the stage at which many developers have just moved into, or are looking into moving. Yeah, it will probably be a while before we reach a full auto bidding setup. Now, just to clarify on some of the key metrics that all of the developers caring about ad monetization should be focusing on. So I listed here 6 important metrics. The first one is engagement rate, or percentage of daily active users who are watching your ads. And this is probably one of the most important metrics, because it shows how visible ads are in your game. Are users even aware that you have ads in the game? And how many of them are actually leveraging the option to watch ads. The second important metric is usage rate, which really shows how many ads are watched by users who are watching them. And then apart from that, there's also impressions per DAU, which basically shows how many ads are watched across your entire daily active user base. So not only people who are watching ads, but actually all of your users. eCPM, or effective cost per mile, shows how much money you're making per 1,000 impressions, per 1,000 ads shown. And as Michal mentioned, this is a very important metric, but is not the most important one. It should definitely be checked, and you should be mindful of it, and you should try to maximize it, but not at all costs. Fill rate is one of the things that's also really important, and the easiest way to explain it is, let's say that you have 1,000 that 1,000 times the user, or several users, or many users clicked on play button inside the game to watch a recorded video. Out of those 1,000 times, if you were able to show an ad 900 times, then it means that you have 90% fill rate. So it basically shows in which percentage of cases you were able to show an ad when the user requested it, or when you wanted to show it, if we're talking about interstitials and banners. And now probably the most important metric to follow is average revenue per daily active users from ads, and of course revenue. And this is something that you should be trying to maximize. So you can easily achieve that your eCPM is probably measured in hundreds, but if your fill rate is low and consequently some other metrics, basically your ARPDAU is not going to be maximized, and that's something you should be mindful of. Now, just I thought that it would be useful to share some benchmarks, especially with guys that are just starting out in the industry or with ads. These are some of the benchmarks I felt would be appropriate to share, and are excluding some extreme cases like hyper-casual games, games that are funded only through ads. So engagement rate, or percentage of daily active users who are watching your ads, and this is specifically for Rewarded Video, should be somewhere between 30 and 50%. And I'm probably being a little bit too conservative because developers have become sophisticated enough, and their implementation is sophisticated enough that probably this is more close now to 40 to 60%. You want to have 40 to 60% of your users watching Rewarded Video ads. When it comes to how many ads those people are watching, I would say it depends really much on the approach and the implementation inside the game, but anywhere between 4 and 8 would probably be something to expect and to aim for. Impressions per DAU, 2 to 4, but again, depends on the implementation. eCPM, it really doesn't make sense to comment on in such a broad and general terms. It very much depends on the country we're talking about. If we're talking about first-year countries such as US, we're probably talking about $20, $30, $40, $50 eCPM. If we're talking about some mid-tier countries, Germany, maybe France, it's going to be below that, but then there are third and fourth-year countries. For example, India, Indonesia, Thailand. In these countries, we are probably, being more realistic if we expect something around $1, $2, maybe $3. It really depends on the user quality. Fill rate, you want to have it as high as possible. Ideally, you want to serve an ad every single time when the user wants to watch an ad. But let's say that something to be, that's reasonable is to aim for above 90%. And then regarding ARPDAU, it can go up to 7 cents. Let's say that you have a significant portion of your users coming from the US or tier 1 countries, and that you have a proper implementation, up to 7 cents is something I would expect. I worked on games that have higher ARPDAU than this or much lower. It just depends on so many factors, what kind of users you're bringing to the game, and others, as well as genre, implementation. This is just a guideline, a very broad guideline of what you can expect. Okay, now I wanted to share some of the best practices for mediation management. Some of the things probably I'll just run through, as Michal already mentioned them, but for others I'll spend more time explaining what I mean. Let's get into it. So, should I do auto optimization or manual waterfall management? I'm going to be really explicit about it and always go with manual waterfall management. And not only in countries that are standing out in terms of revenue or eCPM or impressions or your daily active users. I mean, and I think, truly believe that waterfall management should be done, manual waterfall management should be done in every single country in the world. It just depends on how you're gonna organize those countries into groups in order to spend the reasonable amount of time really managing those countries. On which level the waterfall is set. So there was already some word about it. So each operating system, meaning iOS and Android, they require a separate waterfall. The same is true for different formats. So rewarded video ads, banners, interstitials, they require different waterfalls and countries. So you can actually set just one waterfall, which will be applied globally in every single country in the world. However, I do advise you to make 2, maybe 3 country groups depending on the eCPM, and based on that optimize country-specific or tier group-specific. And something that's been a novelty for now a couple of months probably is the setting your waterfalls depending on whether you have IDFA for your users or not. So identifier for advertisers on users who are using iOS devices. From my experience, what I've seen happening in November this year is that actually eCPMs are much different depending whether we have IDFA for our users or not. And so for some of the clients I'm managing, I've seen a difference between 35 and 55% in eCPM. So users who do have IDFA have higher eCPM, actually significantly higher than the ones that don't. And sometimes, like even like it makes sense to separate those waterfalls and like be more aggressive with IDFA users and less aggressive with those who are not revealing their IDFA. Now, how many waterfalls or mediation groups we should set for one operating system for one ad format? This is a question I get a lot. And actually, I think that it really depends on your scale and geo-distribution. But I would say between 2 and 4. Ideally, you want to have just 2 country groups, but sometimes the third one is required. In my experience so far, 4th country group is probably rarely necessary. So more doesn't necessarily mean more money as well. More groups doesn't necessarily mean more money. So how many instances per network should we use? Again, there's no one size fits all, but I would say that anything between 3 and 5 instances per network, per operating system, and per ad format is reasonable. Michal mentioned having 3 instances for the start, plus 1, meaning 1 without the floor. I agree with that. Probably. When things start taking off, it makes sense to move to 5. So you have highest, high, medium, low, and lowest price, and then you also have that one without the price, just to make sure that the fill is right. How many instances in the waterfall overall we should use? Again, depends on many factors, on your scale, number of networks you're working with. But I would say that between 10 and 30 instances is something common. In most cases, 20-something instances will be enough to cover all your needs. Is there such a thing as too many instances? And if yes, why? There definitely is. Each instance basically adds a little bit of latency to your waterfall. What does it mean? So basically, it means that mediation works like this. It's going to check your instances in a sequential order. And so it takes a little bit of time to check with every single instance if they're able to or willing to show an ad or not. And this can have a negative impact on user experience, especially if they have some connectivity issues with the internet. And it can consume a lot of their data, or it can keep them waiting to get an ad, depending on how you implement stuff. And I'll give you just one example of where we definitely have too many instances. So on the slide, you can see that the first probably 4 or 5 instances are actually, they have the floor set. That's fine. However, they're not delivering any impressions, or they're delivering very few impressions. This means that here in this particular example, we can definitely remove first 4 calls and probably maybe even the 5th one, and try to actually lower the prices and focus on the lower part of the waterfall, meaning from $6 to the bottom, because actually the first few calls are actually not doing us any favors. They are not maximizing our revenue. They're not doing anything really. And so this means that we're keeping our users waiting for no real reason. So yeah, here we definitely have some instances to get rid of. Now, Can I use the same instance for different countries? You most definitely can, and I recommend to use one instance for all of your countries. This is true for most of the networks. There are some exceptions. And then on one instance, you would just set up different prices depending on the country, and this is done on the network side. How do networks know which price or floor to deliver on which instance? So everything is really done on the network side. This means that on the mediation side, only their order is set. So you just put the order of the instances on ironSource or any mediation dashboard like Max or Mopub or Fairbid or AdMob's dashboard, and then on the network side, you actually have to do the entire setup. And most of the networks out there, the big ones, at least are giving you an option to set these prices, these floors on your own on their dashboard. There are a few exceptions where you actually need to ask your account manager, so your point of contact at the network side to change this for you. But in most cases, there are self-serve dashboards where you can deal with this. Okay, how to ensure a good fill rate? Because if you're being too aggressive with the prices, what can happen is that you maximize your eCPM. However, you're leaving a lot of your users without any ads because networks just don't want to show ads at those prices. So basically, make sure that you're not too aggressive with the pricing. Instances in the top of the waterfall should have high price, but those at the bottom should have actually, really lower prices. Make sure that you cover well this lower price segment below $5. To ensure the highest fill rate, I would always include auto optimization instances at the bottom of the waterfall. So those are the instances that do not really have any price, and you accept whatever the ad network gives you. And keep in mind, so sometimes I see that developers are really worried that they have 90% fill rate, and they're thinking, okay, I'm missing on 10% of the revenue, but that's not really true. Usually 90% of the fill rate means that you're missing on the least valuable 10% of the impressions. So if you manage to increase it to 99 or 100%, it doesn't mean that your revenue will proportionally grow, because probably, as I said, you're losing those impressions that are least valuable. Okay, how often should the performance be checked? Actually, I check the performance for my clients every single day, and I advise you to do the same or as close to that as possible. And special attention should be put around game updates, no matter whether they have something ads related or not. Sometimes things can get broken, or in fact, be better with some update that doesn't have anything to do with ads, but it impacts it in some way. Be mindful and pay special attention for some of the issues that may arise. Metrics that you should keep an eye on are the ones that I already mentioned. But just make sure that you're checking these numbers every single day or close to that as possible. And regarding the changes, you do not want to actually make the changes every single day, but based on what you see, based on the data. And one of the things I didn't mention before, you also need to check impressions and eCPM and fill rate per instance, not only on a waterfall level. Okay, how often should the...
Hey, Bojan, quick question on the previous question that you had. When it comes to things like fluctuations, so we know, for example, last week we had everybody pretty much experienced a big increase in their CPMs, mostly due to the fact that we had the sort of the Black Friday, Cyber Monday week, where there's way more advertisers, there's much more activity happening on the network, and as a result, sort of the CPMs increase. When you work with different partners and when you consult different companies, how often do you recommend to sort of plan these sort of fluctuations and potential weeks of increase and decrease beforehand? And would you recommend, especially in this sense, would you recommend as monetization guys to keep sort of a close contact with the user acquisition guys who have actual, real-time data on this, or like should they have any communication between the two departments? And how would like you approach this particular piece?
Okay, yeah, that's a really good question, and I think that if you're mindful of these dates and this seasonality that exists in the industry, you can actually benefit of it and get like real benefits in terms of eCPM and overall revenue that you're making. Usually I try to plan it in a way that around the holidays, so Black Friday, Cyber Monday, Easter, Christmas, New Year's, Thanksgiving Day, and 4th of July, holidays like this, I plan in advance in a way that I plan to allocate more of my time on optimizing waterfalls. It's good to be in touch with the user acquisition team just to make sure to understand what they're saying on their end. But it's also like you can rely on what your waterfall and your data on the monetization side is telling you. For example, at one day, an instance that's set at $70 eCPM price floor can give you 5,000 impressions, which is nice. But then there's a peak, and then suddenly that same instance in that same position is giving you 20,000. That's immediately an indicator that you should be more aggressive and you should either increase the price in this particular instance, or you should add actually another new instance of that same network above it or from some other network. So definitely around the holidays, because this is something I do for my clients, I plan more time to spend in the waterfalls trying to maximize eCPM and consequently the ARPDAU. Yeah.
Thank you.
So let's continue with the presentation. Okay, so how often should the SDKs and adapters be updated? This is something that many developers want to know because it can be a little bit time consuming, or when you have other priorities, it's not something that you want to do too frequently. I would say that it really depends, but in general, I would try to keep my SDKs and adapters up to date and probably not older than 6 months. But some of the things that you should keep in mind, and maybe if you're an ad monetization manager and you're the one who needs to recommend the update to the developers and product team, there are some things to keep in mind and to check. Check always the update notes. Search for some significant improvements, resolution of some critical bugs that you may or may have not been aware of, and in that way you make sure that you only recommend the updates that are really important. Keep in mind what portion of the traffic, the network you're thinking about upgrading, is taking. What portion of the traffic? So if it's a really big network for you, even a small improvement will probably yield in big increase or a significant increase in your performance. And if it's a really, really small network, then maybe it's worth just keeping it. Also make sure that your current version is not going to be depreciated by the network by some deadline, and that you're not actually passing the deadline. Or just check if sometimes the platform holders are also doing are setting some deadlines, and they're saying we're going to stop supporting this function by 31st December. And if that function is used by one of your SDKs or adapters, you need to make sure that you're up to date in order to avoid crashes or ANRs or just complaints by the users, poor performance, and so on. Okay. Now, should I set up an app@txt? This is a really easy question. I would say definitely, most definitely, you should. At GameBiz, we've done an internal research where we checked out top 500 grossing games that contain ads. And according to our research, around 90% of the games have app@txt implemented. And just give you a little bit of a context for those of you who might not be aware of what I'm talking about. So there are 4 very easy implementation steps for ARPDAU. And just to give you a bit broader context, so this is a standard or a recommendation brought to us by International Advertising Bureau, and basically it's meant to reduce fraud and introduce the standard of how how developers and in general those who hold some advertising space with which networks they're working with, and who is really allowed to sell that space. So what you need to do is make sure that on the App Store you have developer website field available on your store on your games page, and on Play Store this is visit website field. Then you need to collect all the details from each of your ad source, and they're going to share 4 parameters. This is ad source domain, your publisher ID, type of relationship, which can be only direct or reseller, and the ad source ID, which is really optional and depends on this ad source. Once you gather all the details, you should put it into one TXT file, and then that TXT file should be put on your website on root of your domain. So www.yourwebsite.com/appets.txt, and this yourwebsite.com should be linked as developer website and visit website on your stores. And you can also check. It comes in handy on AdMob's dashboard. There's really a section where they tell you if they were able to recognize the file or not, so you will know if it's working properly. So basically these are the fields that I was talking about on your stores. Make sure you have them and that they are linked on where they should be. Okay, cool. Now, should we set sellers.json file to transparent? Actually, you should, and there's no reason why not to do it. There's no downside, so I definitely recommend to all of my clients just set this to transparent in your AdMob dashboard and include your website, your domain if you have one. Does it make sense to block competitor ads? Okay, this is a tricky and probably controversial question, and it does have to do with waterfall management, because if you block many of your competitors, what you might end up with is not that many advertisers to show ads in your game. There's less competition, lower eCPMs, lower ARPDAU. So make sure that you know what you're doing. My general advice is that if you're not sure if you should do it, you probably shouldn't, and be careful when blocking any advertiser. There's no industry consensus if this should or shouldn't be done. I know examples of companies, some of them listed here, who are not doing blocking of their competitors. Their assumption and their arguments are that users are going to see these ads anyway in some other game, so there's no point in blocking them in mine. Then higher conversion, because more users are probably going to be more prone to install if they're seeing ads of games that are similar to mine. They're going to have higher conversion, which leads to higher eCPM, higher revenue, ARPDAU, and higher LTV. And some of them have actually done proper A/B tests where they prove that churn and retention have been stable throughout, and that actually showing competitor ads brings higher LTV overall. Now, there are companies as well that are not showing competitor games, or at least on some of their products, and so some arguments that they are providing is that, okay, users will leave my game because they've seen a game that's really similar to mine and they like it, and so this will ultimately lead in lower revenue. Sometimes it's just a strategic decision. Higher management just says we do not want to show competitor ads no matter the consequences, and sometimes they've done a proper A/B test and for them it showed that it's hurting them. So it really depends on each company, but in general, if this is a big topic for you, I think that I think that really, if the retention is a concern and you really want to dig into this, you should do an A/B test, check retention, ARPDAU, in-app purchase ARPDAU, LTV, playtime, but ultimately base your decision on LTV. Okay, are there any options for running some direct deals, like with other games or with some brands, stuff like that? There is, however, I think that depends on your scale. If your scale is really small, it doesn't make sense to do it. And even if your scale is big, with multiple instances set up, probably there's no really need to do it, although you can. One of the last questions, so should we share data with the networks? You should. I do it, and there are some things that are worth sharing, like total number of impressions for the waterfall, their waterfall position, some games-related information like geo-distribution, system design, some of the important updates that you're making, how important ad monetization is for your game overall, just so they have enough context and they can give you proper advice and help with the account. And I think one of the last questions, so is there a discrepancy between data on the mediation and networks dashboard? Usually there is, but if we are talking about less than 5% discrepancy, then I would say it's fine and you don't have to be worried about it. And the very last question, how do I transition from multiple instances to hybrid mediation? This is something that Michal also really well explained. If there's an option with your mediation provider, I would say that doing a proper A/B test is the way to go. If not, then you should just track before and after and see if you can spot the difference and measure the impact hybrid mediation has brought to you. If you can set up an A/B test, make sure that control group stays exactly the same. Experimental group, which contains hybrid mediation, should in that group you replace traditional instances of the bidders and key bidders only. And based on your ARPDAU, you should make a decision, but be also mindful of all of the other metrics that I mentioned. And the last piece of the presentation is really about showing you and not just telling you some of the things I already mentioned, and basically showing these pieces of advice in action. So this is an example from one of my clients, Two Desperados. They have match-free games, and this particular example is from their game Voka Voka. Basically they were running an out optimization setup, and once we started doing manual waterfalls with multiple instances, we were able to increase their eCPM and ARPDAU by 40%. So you depending on how much money you're making per month or per year, this can be easily a 6 or 7 figure number, and it's definitely worth doing it, as we outlined a few times. Again, one more example from Two Desperados. This time it's their game Viola's Quest. I wanted to demonstrate how important it is to communicate with your user acquisition team, and how different a setup can be and performance can be on the same game depending on what your UA team is doing. Here, what I've done is basically you can see the data for probably last 6 months or so, and the first the growth is actually coming from UA only. So it's exactly the same waterfall setup, meaning I haven't been more aggressive in the right part of the graph, or we haven't done any in-game changes, we haven't added any new networks or changed the mediation provider. Actually, the only change that happened is that user acquisition teams started doing a little bit different campaigns. They started increasing their bids, and this led to a huge increase in eCPM. So if you're talking with your colleagues in the industry and you have like $20 eCPM in the US and your colleague is telling you that they have 40, make sure you follow up with some additional questions if you can, because maybe it's not realistic for you to have a $40 eCPM in the US just because of the quality of the users you have in the game. Now, one more example from Two Desperados, and this is actually, again, for their game Voca Voca. We've had COPPA settings on Unity ads enabled to be like targeting children under the age of 13, and this was actually not intentional. This was actually set up by one of the developers when they were setting up the project. And so when I started working with them, I noticed that Unity ads wasn't performing really well. It was taking maybe 1 or 2% of their revenue, and eCPMs were really poor. And when I started digging into it, checking every single thing that came to my mind, one of the last things actually that came to mind is to check these settings. And once we unchecked this box, because we weren't really targeting children with this game, the performance, like actually overall performance for the game on the interstitial ads increased by 22%, so both eCPM and ARPDAU, actually Unity ads started taking, I think, around 20% of overall ad revenue instead of just 1 or 2%. So we were really limiting the demand and blocking most of the advertisers because of this. So once we made the change, it meant a lot for us. With my client Lockwood Publishing and their game Avakin Life, so they had this one setup. They were doing waterfall management with multiple instances. They actually had 4 or 5 country groups, I believe. And once I started analyzing the numbers, I realized that they could achieve the same thing with fewer country groups and investing much less time into waterfall management and maybe spending it somewhere else. And so we did a proper A/B test of having 5 country groups versus having just 2. And it proved actually that less can sometimes be more. So with two country groups instead of 4, we were able to increase actually our ARPDAU by 14%. So it's not that more country groups means always more revenue. Similar approach I took with Creative Mobile and their great game Zoocraft Animal Family. So we were able to increase their ARPDAU by 26% by reorganizing the waterfall and moving from, I think, 5 or 6 country groups into just 2 country groups, which also meant that we were spending much less time managing them. Now, this is one of my clients, Nanobit, with them on their game My Story, which is a story-driven role-playing game. We were able to increase their eCPM and ARPDAU by 22% in Japan by moving it from all countries group, so the group which is contains probably around 150 to 100 countries, and we moved them to a tier 1 country group, and we were able to increase eCPM and ARPDAU by 22%. I'm just giving you this example to show you that you can make the changes in your setup depending on the scale in a particular country, what your user acquisition team is doing, and sometimes it makes sense to just play around with the countries in order to maximize your metrics. Another example with Nanobit, again on My Story, is actually shows how important it is to have certain networks in your mix. This particular example is about adding AdMob. So previously we had some issues where we couldn't use them, but then beginning of June this year, we managed to resolve these issues, and actually our performance increased by 30%, so 30% increase in eCPM and ARPDAU just by adding this one single ad source, one new network to our mix. Now I wanted to share some examples of how testing hybrid mediation, so the approach where we have both bidders and traditional networks with multiple instances, what moving from multiple instances setup only to a hybrid mediation meant for some of my clients. So with Nanobit and their game My Story, there was actually no difference in ARPDAU. So be careful when you're approached with a value proposition saying you're going to increase your ARPDAU by 10, 20, 30%. It's not really the case always. It really depends on your current setup and the game in particular. So nobody can give you a guarantee of how much improvement, if any, will hybrid mediation bring to you. Another client, Smuttlework Interactive, they have a fleet battle, which is really like a board game, and we were able to increase their ARPDAU by 4.5% by transitioning to this hybrid mediation. It's not a lot, but it's still an uplift, and also it meant that we could save some time managing waterfalls. Also, I want to highlight how really important it is to choose your mediation wisely. Not all mediations are equal, and I can tell you that by switching from one mediation platform to another, we were able to increase their ARPDAU by 13%. This is probably the most extreme example I can give in this context. So this is my client, Gold Town Games. They have actually 2 games, World Hockey Manager and World Football Manager. So they're in this sports genre. And previously they were using one mediation solution. When I joined them to help them monetize their games with ads, we recommended to switch to another mediation provider. And this is not a mistake in the slide. So we were able to grow their ARPDAU by 1,240%. It's unbelievable, but still true. So it really depends on who you work with and how you work with them, and it can mean as much as 12 times difference in performance. One more example by Wargaming and their game World of Warships Blitz. So they actually had a setup where they were working with just one game. And then we helped them to transition to a mediated setup with multiple instances, and they were able to increase their eCPM and ARPDAU by 55%, which, as you can imagine, with the wargaming scale, it means a lot in terms of yearly revenue and all other metrics. So yeah, I think that those are actually all the examples I had. In the end, I wanted to highlight some of the takeaways. I always advise developers, clients, friends from the industry to focus on metrics beyond just eCPM. Be mindful of engagement rate, usage rate, impressions per DAU, fill rate, but most importantly, your average revenue per daily active user. Find the right balance between auto-optimization and automation and manual work. It doesn't always mean that having more country groups, more instances, more networks will mean more revenue. So you really need to find the balance there. Choose your partners wisely, meaning mediation providers, ad networks. Make sure that you're working with really reputable players in the market, because it can mean a huge difference in performance. And lastly, stick to the best practices that work well for your game. I just had like one client where we actually had to roll back from hybrid mediation to traditional waterfall with multiple instances, because the performance was actually worse with hybrid. So there's no one size fits all, and I definitely advise you to test stuff and try out stuff and see what works for you well. And with that, I'd like to finish with this formal part of the presentation and open up for questions. You have the contact details on the slide. Feel free to reach out for any questions, help, or anything else you need. Thanks.
Thank you, Bożo, for great presentation. So let's try it actually, directly to this, Q&A and in discussion. There was a lot of very, very valuable content today. And then actually we have a few other topics yet. Like maybe I will start with the actually I think kind of interesting question. Do you see that specific ad types that are like growing in importance? There are like do you see some ad types and formats that are like kind of declining in terms of performance? Could you elaborate on? Do you see any trends in that perspective? Maybe starting
Sir?
Maybe starting from you, Bożo, as you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. In particular, like the ad types or formats that are growing at the highest rate, I would say that probably rewarded video ads are the best performing format. Whether they're really like growing, I cannot say for sure, but I think that the eCPMs are definitely growing on this format, and advertisers are being ever so sophisticated in attracting more users through this format, and also like monetizing users through this format. So this is definitely the format that I would recommend as the number one. And then interstitial ads are performing surprisingly well in terms of if you implement it the right way, so you don't jeopardize the user experience. I think that interstitial ads can be first a really significant revenue source for you, but it can also mean that user experience is not jeopardized, and it can be, for some of developers, rewarded video and interstitials are making the equal amount of money. For some it's much less, but it really depends on your game. But I wouldn't exclude interstitial ads, like just saying, that's part of history, because it's not. Probably the format which I see as least with the least, let's say, potential are probably banners, and they have like 10, 20, 30 times lower eCPMs than rewarded video, which means that you would have to show 10, 20, 30 times the same, more impressions just to have the same amount of revenue. So that's something that to be mindful of. And also, like, banners are not for all games, because you have to actually have some free space on the screen to kind of implement them. So maybe this format is the one that's probably not that valuable, and not to keep not to forget the offer wall. On iOS, they're probably part of the history, unfortunately, but on Android, this ad type can actually bring a lot of value. If your game has strong in-app purchase economy, I would definitely at least consider adding offer walls as well. And they actually, on Android, they're on their highest performance ever. So I think they're still good to check them out.
Michal, could you?
Yeah, I can definitely agree with Bojo, and I can add that on that offer wall, because right now in Pixel Federation we are using the rewarded video, and we currently implemented offer wall for one other title, and we'll bring it on the other titles as well, because the offer wall on Android is working really well. On iOS we are trying to substitute it with rewarded survey, so because our games is somehow coherent on the both platforms, we try to have those ad placements on the both platforms. So rewarded surveys is somehow working on iOS. So it's not the performance of the offer wall on the Android, but it's still worth a shot.
Thank you.
I'll ask maybe the next question to diversify a little bit. Again, coming from the set of questions from Slido, also from personal experience, how do you guys approach? So this is the second question. Do you see or recommend different approaches to setting waterfalls for countries with high CPM versus those that bring a lot of traffic? How do you guys yourselves do this approach? And do you have any top tips that you would recommend anyone who is setting this up right now?
Yeah, maybe I'm trying to kind of approach those waterfalls pretty much the same, but there is a different scenario when you will have many impressions, but probably low eCPM, and maybe the kind of fewer impressions with high eCPM. So you will just adjust the floors for those specific reasons. So you will be more granular in India, for example. So you will be doing really small increasing in the eCPM, because with that amount of impressions, every single small portion of the higher floor matter. And with the US and for example, like fewer impressions, I will do kind of a bigger jumps in the eCPM floor.
Bożo, would you like to add something, or you're mute, I think. Bożo, you're mute.
Sorry. Yeah, so I generally agree with what Michal said, and I see we have a lot of questions, so we should probably move to the next one.
Okay, so maybe like I see the question around like if you could explain why in some cases this less country groups in Waterfall can actually work better than like more of them.
Okay, so I can maybe cover that one because that's something I brought in the presentation as well. It can. There are several reasons why. Let's say that when you break down your revenue per country, and you start analyzing, okay, how many waterfall groups or country groups I want to have, and then like you see that US has, and you're trying to group them by eCPM, yes. And so let's say US has $20. Germany has 15, and I don't know, Turkey has 5, and then all other countries have around 4, 5, something like that. So what they're, you can group them however you want, but sometimes what I've seen developers do is they take US because they have 20 and they put it into one group. And they take Germany with 15, they put it into another group, and they take all other countries and put it in the third group. However, I would try to be a little bit more bold and put Germany together with the US, because like being more aggressive with the prices sometimes can actually bring higher eCPMs. And so if you had US and Germany into two different groups in this particular example, with Germany you would be less aggressive, and you would probably start at 20 and then go down, and you're just not maximizing your eCPM. Whereas if you're putting it with United States, you would start with 30, and then like some impressions, maybe not the same fill as with US, some impressions will be served with these highest instances, and that's why you are going to make more money. And the second thing, which I think sometimes developers forget about, is that you have just a limited capacity in terms of your attention and brain power. And so if you're trying to maximize ARPDAU and eCPM across 10 country groups, probably you're not giving enough attention to each of those groups. And so like having less groups to work with will probably make you more effective and can make your job easier while not jeopardizing the performance.
Very nice. I'll ask the last question, but before that, so we have 3 questions on the screen. 2 of them I would assume are related for user acquisition related topics. So we will not potentially be covering those now, but I'm going to ask the question, which I'm also very curious to hear from you, is like, what kind of help are you getting from ad network managers? Like, based on the question, where do you see your chances to like get higher CPMs from them? Can you explain the process? I would be also very curious to hear, as I am the one working with both of you from the side of AdMob. So,
okay, so I can start. Basically, I think that from the beginning, the thing there is that there is absolutely some kind of whitelisting the products and the games for ads. So this was something that brings a lot of value to our games when we spoke to our account managers on all those networks. Basically, we having like regular discussions with our account managers. I think it's really important, and we try to find out the kind of a best scenario for us. So I sending and I sharing the data for our performance, and our account managers and Vlad is giving us advice about what to try, what's the kind of industry, where the industry is heading, if some developers from their portfolio tried some new approach and it worked well, they will share this type of information with us. And it's really, I think it's really helpful, because if your ad performance grow and if your ad revenue grow, their share, the ad network's share, will grow as well. So I think that I'm pretty open speaking about the ad monetization metrics with our account managers, because if your mediator will see them, I think that it's okay to let everybody knows.
Bożo, would you like to add something? Or?
No, I think Michal did pretty much covered everything. So, yeah.
Okay. The last two questions are more about user acquisition, and of course we have a few webinars and different sessions around that. But actually, more or less, like looking at those questions, it goes actually to making sure that as we as company. Like promoting specific product or service, we understand the lifetime value of the prospective user, and in this case, it's around the good cooperation of the user acquisition team and ad monetization team. Actually, from that perspective, yeah. At that time, I really would like to thank you, like all of you, for for sharing experience with the industry, preparation, and thank you really for sharing that data, that experience with the with the gaming folks. And so for all people that are on with us yet, thank you for your time. I really, of course, encourage you to look at the GameCamp for another sessions that are happening even in the next weeks. We have in the end of December, we have the session around the VCs. Those VCs that actually are investing their resources and money into gaming projects. How to get prepared actually if you want to get financing from the VC. I really encourage you. 17th of December, 3 p.m. as well. And then in the next week, we have the session around the hyper casual, around the trends in the art, in the growth of those games. It's actually quite interesting phenomenon in the industry. So I really encourage you to look at that and be with us in 1 week and in 2 weeks. Again, thank you for your time and thank you for your presence. Of course, we will encourage you to share feedback with us. If you registered at the beginning of the session, you will be asked for the feedback. And actually, I really would like to ask you for the feedback, because that actually makes us making that better for the industry. So Bożo, Michal, Vlad, thank you for your time, and thank you for sharing experience again. And to everyone, I wish you a really good day today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariusz.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.